Ambassador Verteth stood on the observation deck of his flagship and stared at the blue planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. And he felt nothing but pity for the creatures living on its surface. The Kethmari hegemony had sent him on what everyone considered a simple mission. And that mission was to assess the primitive species called humans and determine how they would be absorbed into galactic civilization. His people had done this hundreds of times before with dozens of young species. And the process was always the same. First came observation. Then came first contact. Then came the offer of protection. And finally came absorption into one of the great powers of the Galactic Concord. The humans would be no different. Or so Verteth believed as he reviewed the intelligence reports that his analysts had prepared. For him, the reports painted a picture that was both amusing and sad. Humanity had only recently discovered how to leave their own planet, and their ships were powered by primitive chemical rockets that burned fuel like ancient torches. They had built a small station in orbit around their world, and they seemed very proud of this accomplishment. But Verteth had seen children's toys with more advanced technology. Their communication systems were laughably basic, and their weapons were crude projectile throwers and primitive nuclear devices that any proper shield system could deflect without effort. But what struck Verteth most was not their technological weakness. It was their constant fighting. The humans never stopped making war against each other. His analysts had documented thousands of conflicts throughout human history. Wars fought over land and resources and ideas and religion, and sometimes for reasons that made no sense at all. They divided themselves into tribes they called nations. And these nations competed and fought and killed each other in an endless cycle of violence. Verteth had seen this pattern before in other young species. And it usually meant one of two things. Either the species would destroy itself before achieving space travel, or it would be so weakened by internal conflict that absorption would be effortless. The humans had somehow managed to reach space, despite their fighting, which meant they fell into the second category. They would be easy prey. Verteth turned to his senior analyst, a younger Kethmari named Silvera, who had spent 3 cycles studying Earth from long-range observation posts. What is your assessment of their military capability? Verteth asked. Silvera made a gesture of dismissal with her secondary arms. They are not a threat. Ambassador, she replied. Their most powerful weapons could barely scratch the hull of a standard patrol vessel. And their ships have no faster-than-light capability whatsoever. And their population, nearly 8 billion. Which makes them an excellent labor resource, Silvera said. They are also surprisingly adaptable and can survive in many different environments. Verteth nodded slowly as he considered this information. 8 billion workers would be a valuable addition to the hegemony. And the humans' adaptability meant they could be put to work on many different worlds. The Concord would approve of this acquisition. There is one thing that concerns me, Silvera added after a moment of hesitation. Speak. The humans have an unusual number of military assets for a species that has not yet made contact with the wider galaxy, she said. They maintain standing armies numbering in the millions, fleets of aircraft and naval vessels that span their oceans, and weapons stockpiles that seem excessive for their internal conflicts. You said their weapons were primitive. They are primitive by our standards, Silvera agreed. But they have many of them, and they seem to invest enormous resources in developing new ones. Verteth made a sound that was the Kethmari equivalent of a laugh. They fight each other constantly, he said. Of course they have many weapons. Yes, Ambassador, Silvera said. But she did not seem entirely convinced. Verteth dismissed her concerns without another thought. He had seen 100 species like the humans, young and aggressive and so busy fighting themselves that they never saw the larger predators. Circling above them, the Galactic Concord was old. and its great powers had perfected the art of absorption over millions of years. They did not conquer through brute force. Not anymore. They offered protection and technology and access to the wider galaxy. And young species always accepted because the alternative was to be left alone in a universe full of dangers. They could not comprehend the humans would accept the same offer. They would have no choice. Varteth ordered his fleet of 12 cruisers to take up position near the fourth planet of the human system, a dead red world the humans called Mars. From there, he would initiate first contact protocols and begin the process of bringing humanity into the hegemony's fold. He expected the whole affair to take perhaps a few cycles, and then he would move on to his next assignment. What Varteth did not know, what none of the Galactic Concord knew, was that their intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The observation posts had been watching humanity for decades, but they had only seen what the humans allowed them to see. The chemical rockets and fragile space stations were real, but they were only part of the picture. The endless wars were real too. But the Concord's analysts had fundamentally misunderstood what they meant. They saw the wars as evidence of human weakness and disunity. They did not see them as what they truly were. Practice for 10,000 years, humanity had been refining the art of war against the most dangerous enemy they had ever faced, which was themselves. Every battle had taught them new lessons, and every conflict had driven new innovations. They had developed weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand stars. They had built ships that moved through space in ways the Concord had never imagined. And they had hidden these ships in places no one thought to look. They had done all of this not to conquer the galaxy, but because they knew, deep in their bones, that the universe was vast and dark and full of unknown dangers. They had looked up at the stars and asked themselves a simple question: what if something is looking back? And so they had prepared. The humans had detected the Kethmari observation posts years ago, and they had decided to let the aliens watch. They had shown the Concord exactly what they wanted them to see. A primitive species too busy fighting itself to pose any threat. It was the oldest trick in human military history. Let the enemy underestimate you. Let them think you are weak, and when they finally make their move, show them how wrong they were. Ambassador Varteth would learn this lesson very soon, and when he did, the entire galaxy would learn it with him. First contact happened on a Tuesday morning, and to Ambassador Varteth's surprise, it went remarkably well. The humans had detected his fleet's approach almost immediately, which was unexpected for a species with such primitive sensor technology. But Varteth assumed they had simply gotten lucky. A transmission came from their planet within hours of his arrival, and the message was simple and polite. "Welcome to our solar system," the human voice said. "We have been expecting you." Varteth found the greeting strange, but assumed it was merely a translation error. The humans sent a delegation to meet him, traveling in one of their primitive chemical rockets that took several days to reach his position near Mars. When the human vessel finally docked with his flagship, Varteth was surprised. Again, he had expected the humans to be frightened or awed by the size and technology of his ship. But the three humans who stepped aboard showed neither fear nor wonder. They introduced themselves as diplomats from something called the United Nations, and they spoke with calm confidence that seemed entirely out of place for representatives of such a young species. Their leader was a woman named Admiral Chun, and despite her diplomatic title, Varteth noticed that she wore a military uniform beneath her formal robes. "We are honored by your visit," Admiral Chun said through a translation device that the humans had somehow developed in the short time since detecting his fleet. "The honor is mine," Varteth replied with practiced grace. "The Kethmari hegemony extends its greetings to the people of Earth." What followed was several hours of diplomatic conversation that covered The basics of galactic civilization. Verteth explained the structure of the Galactic Concord and the role of the great powers. Within it, he described the benefits of joining the hegemony as a protectorate world, including access to advanced technology and protection from hostile species. The humans listened carefully and asked many questions, some of which surprised Vorteth with their sophistication. They wanted to know about the political relationships between the great powers, about the history of the Concord, about the rules that governed interactions between species. They did not ask about weapons or defenses, which Vorteth found reassuring. It suggested they understood their vulnerability and were eager for protection. By the end of the meeting, Vorteth was confident that Earth would accept protectorate status within a few more cycles of negotiation. The humans seemed reasonable and intelligent, if somewhat primitive, and they clearly recognized the advantages of joining galactic civilization. He was wrong, of course, but he would not discover this for several more hours. The trouble began when the Dreth arrived. The Dreth Imperium was one of the oldest and most aggressive powers in the galaxy, and their philosophy was simple. The strong ruled and the weak served. They had been watching the Kethmari delegation from a distance, waiting to see what treasures the humans might offer before making their own move. Warlord Kolvex commanded the Dreth fleet, and he was known throughout the galaxy as a brutal and ambitious leader who had conquered a dozen worlds in his rise to power. He had no patience for the Kethmars. Careful diplomacy. When his battle swarm of 200 warships emerged from fold space above Earth's moon, he fully expected the Kethmari to withdraw and the humans to surrender. His ships spread across the space between Earth and its moon like a swarm of predatory insects, each one bristling with weapons that could reduce cities. To Ash Kolvex transmitted his demands on all frequencies. This world and its people now belong to the Dreth Imperium. His voice boomed across the void. Surrender immediately or face total annihilation on the Kethmari flagship. Ambassador Vorteth felt his heart sink. The Dreth had ruined everything with their typical aggression, and now the humans would either be enslaved or destroyed before the hegemony could claim them. He turned to Admiral Chun with genuine regret in his voice. "I am sorry," he said. "We cannot protect you from the Dreth." "Protect us?" Admiral Chun asked, and there was something in her voice that Vorteth could not identify. "Your people are brave, but you cannot fight the Dreth," Vorteth explained. "Their weapons could crack your planet like an egg." Admiral Chun looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that confused him completely. She smiled. "Ambassador," she said calmly, "I need to ask you a question." "Now is not the time for questions. It is a simple question," she continued. "Are the Dreth hostile to humanity?" Vorteth stared at her in disbelief. "They just threatened to annihilate your world. So that is a yes." "Of course it is a yes," Vorteth said, his voice rising with frustration. "You need to surrender immediately if you want any chance of survival." Admiral Chun nodded slowly, and then she pressed something on her wrist that Vorteth had assumed was merely a decorative bracelet. "United Earth Defense Command," she said into the device. "This is Admiral Chun." A voice responded instantly, clear and strong. "Go ahead." "Admiral, we have confirmed hostile intent from the Dreth fleet," she said. 200 warships in lunar orbit. "Understood. You are authorized to engage." "Authorization confirmed," the voice replied. "All stations, condition red." Vorteth grabbed Admiral Chun's arm, an act that would have been considered deeply inappropriate under normal circumstances. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Responding to an act of war," she said simply. "You cannot fight them." Vorteth insisted. "Your ships are primitive. Your weapons are worthless. You will be destroyed." Admiral Chun gently removed his hand from her arm and met his eyes with an expression that made his blood run cold. It was not fear or desperation. It was pity. "Ambassador Verteth," she said softly, "please return to your fleet and withdraw to a safe distance." "A safe distance from what?" "From the battle that is about to happen," she said. "We recommend positioning beyond lunar orbit." "There will be no battle," Verteth protested. "There will only be a slaughter." "Yes," Admiral Chun agreed, and her smile returned. "There will be." She turned and walked toward the airlock where her shuttle waited, and her two companions followed without a word at the doorway. She paused and looked back at the ambassador. "Thank you for the warning about the Dreth," she said. "We have known about them for some time, but it was helpful to confirm their hostility directly. You have known about them. We have known about all of you," Admiral Chun said. "We have been watching you, watching us for many years." Before Verteth could respond, she was gone, and then the space around Earth began to change in ways that defied everything he knew about young civilizations and primitive species and ambassador. Verteth finally understood that he had made a terrible mistake. Warlord Kovacs stood on the command bridge of his flagship and waited for the humans to surrender. He had conquered many worlds in his lifetime, and the pattern was always the same. First came the threats, then came the terror, and finally came the submission. Young species never fought back against the Dreth, because fighting back was suicide. His 200 warships represented more firepower than most civilizations encountered in their entire history, and the primitive humans with their chemical rockets had no hope of resistance. The surrender would come soon, and then the real work would begin, sorting the population into useful workers and disposing of those too old or weak to serve, cataloging the planet's resources and establishing extraction operations, breaking the will of any who might. Think of rebellion. Kovacs had done this many times, and he was very good at it, but the surrender did not come. Instead, his sensor officer made a sound of confusion. "Warlord," the officer said, "I am detecting unusual energy signatures from the planet's surface." "What kind of signatures?" "I am not certain," the officer admitted. "They do not match anything in our databases." Kovacs felt a flicker of irritation. His officers were supposed to be competent, and confusion was not a quality he valued. "Show me." He commanded. The main display shifted to show Earth's surface, and Kovacs watched as massive structures began to emerge from beneath the ground. They rose from every continent, enormous installations that had been completely hidden from view just moments before hatches opened across mountain ranges and desert plains, revealing weapons platforms that pointed toward the sky. "What is this?" Kovacs demanded. "Warlord, I am detecting similar activity on the planet's moon." The display shifted again, and Kovacs felt his confidence falter for the first time. Earth's moon, which all intelligence had indicated was a dead and empty rock, was coming alive. Sections of the surface slid open to reveal vast complexes buried beneath the lunar dust. Hundreds of weapon emplacements emerged from craters and valleys, each one larger than his flagship. And then the asteroid belt beyond Mars lit up with thousands of engine signatures as ships that had been running dark suddenly revealed themselves. "Warlord," the sensor officer said, and his voice was trembling now, "I am counting over 3,000 human vessels." "That is impossible." "They were hidden," the officer said. "They were completely dark until now." Kovacs stared at the display as the scope of his miscalculation became clear. The humans had not been a primitive species struggling with internal conflicts. They had been a species that understood the value of secrecy and preparation. They had hidden their true strength so completely that not even the Galactic Concord had suspected it, and now that strength was being revealed. And it was terrifying. The first human weapons fired before Kovacs could issue any orders from the lunar installations came beams of energy so concentrated that they simply erased the first wave of Dreth ships. There was no explosion, no debris field, nothing. The ships were simply there one moment and gone the next. Converted to pure energy by weapons that should not exist, evasive maneuvers, Kolvex screamed, his fleet scattered. But the human assault had only begun. From Earth's surface came projectiles that moved at a significant fraction of light speed, crossing the distance between the planet and the Dreth fleet in seconds. These kinetic impactors struck their targets with force that made nuclear weapons look like fireworks, Dreth warships, each one protected by shields that could withstand plasma bombardment for hours. Shattered like glass ornaments struck by hammers, the human ships from the asteroid belt engaged next. And they moved in ways that should have been impossible. They did not fly in straight lines or predictable curves. They jumped through short-range fold space in rapid succession, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, firing devastating volleys before vanishing again. Kovacs had never seen tactics like this. His gunners could not track targets that refused to stay in one place. And his shields were useless against weapons that bent space itself in the first 3 minutes of the battle. He lost 50 ships by minute 7. He had lost over 100. His fleet, which had conquered worlds, which had crushed civilizations, which had never known defeat, was being systematically dismantled by a species that was supposed to be primitive. All ships, Kovacs transmitted. Focus fire on the lunar installations. If he could destroy the source of those terrible energy beams, perhaps his remaining ships could escape. But the human ships anticipated his order and moved to intercept, placing themselves between the Dreth fleet and the moon with coordinated precision that suggested they could read his thoughts. More of his ships died. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted 11 minutes when it was over. 198 Dreth warships had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris and radiation. Only 2 ships remained, both heavily damaged and unable to fight. One of them was Kolvek's flagship. The warlord stood in the ruins of his bridge, surrounded by fires and sparking consoles and the bodies of his officers. And he could not understand what had happened. He had brought 200 warships to conquer a primitive world, and he had been utterly destroyed. A transmission came through on his damaged communication system. Dreth vessel. This is the United Earth Defense Command, a human voice said. Your fleet has been neutralized. Your weapons are offline, and your engines are disabled. Kovacs said nothing. You will be boarded and taken into custody, the voice continued. Any resistance will result in the destruction of your vessel. Kill me, Kovacs said finally. I will not be taken alive. That is not your choice to make, the voice replied. Within minutes, human soldiers breached his flagship. They moved through the corridors with terrifying efficiency, securing each section in seconds. When they reached the bridge, Kovacs tried to fight them with his bare hands. It made no difference. They subdued him without killing him, which somehow made the defeat even more humiliating as they dragged him from his ruined ship. Kovacs saw the human fleet assembling in the space where his armada had been 3,000 vessels, each one more advanced than anything the Dreth Imperium possessed, hung in perfect formation, and behind them, Earth spun slowly in the darkness. Beautiful and blue and utterly unconquered, a message was transmitted on all frequencies, reaching every ship and station and listening post in the system. This is Admiral Chun of the United Earth Defense Command, the voice said. To all observers from the Galactic Concord, we offer the following statement. Earth is not a primitive world waiting to be absorbed. Earth is not a prize to be claimed. Earth is our home, and we will defend it against any threat. We have no desire for conquest, but we will not be conquered. We are willing to live in peace with any species that offers peace in return. But if you come for our world, if you come for our people, if you come with weapons and threats and demands for submission, We will show you exactly what humanity is capable of. The Dreth learned this lesson today. We hope no one else needs to learn it the same way. The transmission ended. And Ambassador Verteth, watching from his flagship far beyond the battle zone, began to understand that the galaxy had fundamentally changed, and he knew that his report to the Galactic Concord would change it even more. Ambassador Verteth's report reached the Galactic Concord 3 days after the battle, and it spread through the great powers like fire through dry grass. Every government, every military command, every intelligence agency in the known galaxy received copies of the sensor data that Verteth had recorded. They watched as 200 Dreth warships were annihilated in 11 minutes. They watched as weapons that defied known physics erased ships from existence. They watched as a species that everyone had dismissed as primitive revealed itself to be one of the most dangerous civilizations the galaxy had ever seen. And then they watched it again and again and again. Military analysts studied every frame of the battle, trying to understand the technology they were seeing. Some of the weapons were recognizable in principle, if not in execution. Kinetic impactors and directed energy systems that simply operated at scales no one had thought possible. But other weapons were completely unknown. Devices that seemed to bend space and time in ways that violated fundamental laws of physics. The humans had somehow developed fold space technology that allowed their ships to make micro-jumps in rapid succession, something that the Concord scientists had always believed to be theoretically impossible. The short-range fold space jumps should have torn the ships apart or created catastrophic cascade failures. Instead, the humans used them as a tactical advantage, appearing and disappearing like spirits of death, the Kethmari. Hegemony was the first to react officially. They quietly withdrew all claims to the Sol Sector and issued new orders to their exploration fleets. Earth and its surrounding systems were to be avoided unless specifically invited. Any Kethmari vessel that approached human space without authorization would be considered rogue and would receive no support from the hegemony. Other powers followed within days. The Valeth Confederation, which had been planning their own expedition to Earth, canceled all related operations. The Mindari Collective, whose vast information networks had also failed to detect humanity's true capabilities, began a complete review of their intelligence-gathering methods. The Sirith Dominion, known for their aggressive expansion, suddenly decided that the opposite side of the galaxy was much more interesting than the region containing Earth. Even the normally belligerent states that existed outside the Concords formal structure found reasons to look elsewhere, but no reaction was more significant than the Dreth Imperiums. For a species built on vengeance and honor and the absolute necessity of responding to any insult with overwhelming force, the loss of 200 warships should have demanded immediate retaliation. Warlords throughout the Imperium should have been gathering their fleets and demanding the blood of humanity. Instead, there was silence. The Imperium's ruling council met in emergency session and reviewed the same recordings that everyone else had seen. They ran simulations of potential counterattacks, modeling various scenarios with different fleet sizes and strategies. The results were always the same. Defeating Earth would require a coalition of forces larger than any the galaxy had ever assembled. The war would last decades. Casualties would number in the trillions, and victory was not guaranteed. For the first time in their history, the Dreth Imperium chose not to seek revenge. They simply pretended the battle had never happened and focused their aggression elsewhere throughout the galaxy. This silence spread and deepened where before there had been constant chatter about humanity, speculation about their potential, and debate about which power would claim them. Now, there was nothing. No one talked about Earth. No one made plans for Earth. No one even acknowledged that humanity existed unless absolutely necessary. It was as if the entire galaxy had collectively decided to ignore the blue planet in the hopes that it would ignore them in return. But the silence was not merely political, it was existential, because what truly frightened the great powers was not humanity's weapons, it was what those weapons revealed about human nature. Every species in the galaxy had a history of violence. War was universal, a constant across all civilizations that had ever achieved space travel. But most species outgrew their violent phases relatively quickly. Once they developed weapons capable of extinction-level destruction, they either destroyed themselves or learned to stop fighting. The survivors focused their energy outward, competing with other species rather than each other. Humanity had done something different. They had developed extinction-level weapons thousands of years before achieving space travel. And they had not destroyed themselves. They had developed planet-killing capabilities and then simply agreed not to use them. They had spent millennia fighting each other, refining the art of war to levels that no other species had ever imagined. And yet they had somehow maintained the ability to cooperate. They had built an arsenal capable of challenging any power in the galaxy while hiding it so completely that no one had suspected it existed, and they had done all of this not out of aggression or imperial ambition, but out of caution. They had looked up at the stars and assumed that danger was waiting there, so they had prepared for that danger while hoping it would never come. This was what the galaxy could not understand and what frightened them most. Humanity's capacity for violence was obvious, but so was their capacity for restraint. They could have used those terrible weapons against each other, but they chose not to. They could have launched preemptive strikes against the observation posts that watched them, but they chose not to. They could have pursued the fleeing remnants of the Dreth fleet and destroyed them, but they chose not to. They had captured Warlord Kolvex alive when killing him would have been easier. What kind of species showed mercy to an enemy who had threatened to annihilate their world? What kind of species built world-ending weapons and then chose not to use them? What kind of species prepared for war with such thoroughness while genuinely hoping for peace? The great powers of the galaxy had no framework for understanding such a species. Their own histories were full of conquest and domination and the simple logic of the strong ruling the weak. Humanity operated by different rules that seemed contradictory and impossible. They were warriors who did not want war. They were conquerors who did not want to conquer. They were the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered, and they genuinely seemed to want nothing more than to be left alone. So the galaxy left them alone. The silence stretched from days to weeks to months to years. Earth existed in a bubble of emptiness, surrounded by vast stretches of space that no one would enter uninvited, and humanity waited, patient and prepared, hoping that their message had been understood. They did not want to fight, but they would if they had to, and everyone who might have forced that fight decided that wisdom was better than valor. The galaxy had gone silent, and in that silence, everything began to change. 5 years had passed since the battle that changed everything, and the galaxy was slowly learning what humanity truly was. It began with small gestures that confused everyone. The humans released Warlord Kolvex. This fact alone was enough to send shockwaves through the Galactic Concord. The Dreth leader who had threatened to enslave their entire species was simply allowed to leave after what the humans called a period of rehabilitation. He was not executed, not imprisoned for life, not even held for ransom. He was released. When Kolvex returned to the Dreth Imperium, his people expected him to immediately begin planning vengeance. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He began speaking of peace. He described his time among the humans How they had treated him not as a defeated enemy, but as a person capable of change. They had shown him their world, their history, their art and music and literature. They had explained why they fought so hard to protect themselves, and why they hoped they would never have to fight again. And somewhere in those years of captivity, something had shifted inside the old warlord. He was not weak. He told his people, the humans had not broken his spirit or destroyed his pride. They had simply shown him a different way of seeing the universe. And he had chosen to listen. The Dreth Imperium did not know what to do with this changed leader, and many called for his execution as a traitor. But enough of the younger generation had seen the recordings of the battle, and enough of them understood that the old ways would only lead to destruction. Kovacs lived, and his message spread, and slowly the Dreth began to change. This was humanity's first gift to the galaxy, though they did not call it that. Their second gift was more tangible. Human diplomats began traveling through the Concord, not as conquerors or even as equals demanding recognition, but as friends offering help. They shared technology that had nothing to do with weapons, medical advances that could cure diseases that had plagued alien species for millennia, energy systems that were clean and efficient and could be adapted to almost any environment, agricultural techniques that could feed entire worlds that had known hunger for generations. They asked for nothing in return. When the Kathmari ambassador asked why humanity was giving away such valuable knowledge, the human diplomat Sarah Chun gave an answer that became famous throughout the galaxy. We spent 10,000 years learning how to kill each other, she said. We became very good at it, perhaps the best in the galaxy. And that knowledge brought us nothing but suffering. But we also learned something else along the way. We learned how to heal each other, how to feed each other, how to lift each other out of darkness. That knowledge is worth sharing. The weapons we will keep, because the universe is still dangerous and we are still careful. But the medicine and the food and the technology that makes life better instead of ending it, those things are meant to be given away. That is what we believe, and that is how we will live among you. The great powers did not understand this philosophy, but they could not deny its effects. Worlds that had been poor and desperate began to flourish. Species that had been on the edge of extinction found new hope. The balance of power that had defined the galaxy for millions of years began to shift in ways no one had predicted, and through it all, humanity asked for only one thing. They wanted to help. They established something called humanitarian missions to the poorest and most war-torn regions of the Concord. They built schools and hospitals and infrastructure on worlds that had never known such things. They sent teachers and doctors and engineers to places that the great powers had abandoned as worthless, and they defended these missions with the same terrible efficiency they had shown in the battle 5 years before. Pirates and raiders who had preyed on weak worlds for generations quickly learned that attacking a human aid convoy was suicide. The same weapons that had destroyed 200 Dreth warships could just as easily eliminate a handful of raiders. But the humans did not seek out fights. They simply made it clear that anyone under their protection was truly protected. The Galactic Concord eventually offered humanity a seat on the highest council, and to everyone's surprise, they accepted. But they did not accept as a junior member seeking guidance or as a conqueror demanding submission. They accepted as equals, and they immediately began advocating for changes that made the great powers uncomfortable. They proposed limits on weapons that could destroy inhabited planets. They suggested tribunals to address crimes against sentient species. They called for aid programs to help developing civilizations advance without being absorbed by larger powers. Many of these proposals were rejected, at least at first, but the humans were patient, And they kept coming back with new arguments and new evidence and new allies who had seen the benefits of their approach. Slowly, vote by vote and year by year, things began to change. Ambassador Verteth, who would become humanity's unlikely friend and advocate in the Concord, watched these changes with wonder. He had first seen humans as primitives to be absorbed, then as monsters to be feared, and now as something else entirely. Something the galaxy had never seen before. A colleague asked him once why the humans bothered with all their charity and diplomacy. They had the power to take whatever they wanted. Why did they waste resources on species that could offer nothing in return? Verteth thought carefully before answering. You still do not understand them, he said at last. The humans are not generous despite their power. They are powerful because of their generosity. They protect each other. They fight for their families, their nations, their species, and now they fight for anyone who asks for help. They terrify us because we can see ourselves in them. The violence, the tribalism, the capacity for cruelty, all of it mirrors what we have been for millions of years. But they also show us something else. They show us that a species can look into the abyss of its own nature and choose to be better. They show us that strength can be used for protection instead of conquest. They show us that the universe does not have to be a place where the strong devour the weak. That is why the galaxy went silent when we first saw what they could do. Not because we fear their weapons, although we should, but because we fear what they represent. They represent the possibility that we have no excuse for what we have become. They represent the possibility that we could change, if we chose to, and that possibility is the most terrifying thing any of us have ever faced. Verteth turned to look out at the stars. Countless points of light in the infinite darkness. The humans have a saying, he continued, that those who beat their swords into plowshares will feed the world. They still have their swords. Make no mistake, but they have also chosen to carry plowshares. And they are asking us to do the same. The question now is whether we are brave enough to accept that invitation. The galaxy went silent 5 years ago. Perhaps it is time for us to start speaking again. But this time, perhaps we should choose different words. Far away, on a blue planet circling an ordinary yellow star, humanity continued its work. They built, and they healed, and they taught. And they protected. They hoped for peace while preparing for war. They offered friendship to those who would, accepted, and showed strength to those who would not. And they waited for the galaxy to make its choice, because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Show the universe who you are and hope that others will choose to be better. Humanity had made its choice long ago, forged in the fire of 10,000 years of war and tempered by the desperate hope that war did not have to be forever. Now it was the galaxy's turn to decide what it wanted to be, and whatever that decision was, humanity would be ready. They always were at the end.